In this video, I'm going to be testing out the Sony 85mm f1.8 against the Samyang 85mm f1.4 to figure out which one of these lenses is the best option for your money. As always, let's start off this test by taking a closer look at each of these lenses. These days on Amazon you can pick up this Sony 85mm f1.8 for around £480 or $548, and the lens itself is pretty lightweight at just 371 grams or 13.1 ounces. In terms of size, the Sony is noticeably smaller than the Samyang, though this is somewhat to be expected as its rival has a larger maximum aperture of f1.4 compared to the Sony's f1.8. The lens is built from a mixture of metal and hard plastics, and on the lens barrel it features a manual MF to AF switch and a customizable button that can be used as a shortcut to access a bunch of camera settings. Moving over to the Samyang, which is also sometimes known as Rokinon, it's the same manufacturer, I don't know why they have two different names, but they do. This option is priced at £539 or $539 on Amazon. In terms of weight, this lens is slightly heavier than the Sony at 568 grams or approximately 20 ounces, but considering this lens is an f1.4, it's still pretty lightweight. Construction-wise, this lens is also made up from a similar mix of metal and hard plastics, though it doesn't have any shortcut buttons on the lens barrel, which does mean that switching between auto and manual focus has to be done via the back of your camera. One slight advantage that the Samyang has over its rival is the fact that it offers some weather sealing thanks to a small rubber gasket around the metal lens mount. So now we've taken a look at our two contenders, let's get stuck into what really matters, which is seeing how these lenses handle when shooting out in the field. Both lenses operated quickly and quietly in good lighting conditions with no obvious signs of hunting. In low light, the performance was pretty much unchanged for both of these lenses, and again, there was no signs of hunting. Well, that's great then, lads, but both lenses work absolutely fine. Well, not quite, but I'll touch on that a little later on in the video. Switching over to video mode, and when shooting wide open with both of these lenses, they were able to track Amber's movements as she walked towards the camera at a regular pace with no issues at all. However, when we repeated the test with Amber moving at a slightly faster pace, the Sony was able to keep up with no issues, but the Samyang struggled ever so slightly to keep locked on throughout the entirety of the walk. Now yes, the Samyang does have the slightly harder job here as it's f1.4 and it offers a slightly shallower depth of field than the f1.8 of the Sony, so there is less of an in-focus area. I appreciate that, but the difference between f1.4 and f1.8 is really not that extreme, especially at these distances, and I've tested plenty of other f1.4 85mm lenses in the past that are able to keep up with fast-moving subjects absolutely fine, namely the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DGDN and the Sony 85mm f1.4 G Master, so in theory the Samyang really shouldn't struggle. As for AF noise, both of these lenses were very quiet. If I had to pick a winner out of the two, it would have to be the Sony, which just doesn't make any noise at all. Whereas the Samyang does make a slight clicking noise which could be picked up by onboard microphones whilst recording video. Okay, so before we take a look at some real-life test images, let's quickly see how these lenses handle on our test chart, which should give us a good indication of how sharp these lenses are and whether they suffer from any kind of lens defects like distortion or chromatic aberration. Starting with the Sony, when shooting at f1.8, we can see that this lens has some pincushion distortion and vignetting around the edges, so these issues may need to be cleaned up in Lightroom or Photoshop if this type of thing bothers you. Zooming into the middle, and this lens is nice and sharp, however, there is a noticeable amount of blue fringing appearing around the circles, which isn't ideal. At the edges, the image starts to soften ever so slightly, and we can also see some more of that chromatic aberration showing through, but overall, not a bad result from the Sony. The Sony has a minimum focusing distance of 0.8 meters or 2.63 feet, and when shooting at this distance the results are nice and sharp, though that blue fringing is still a problem. Moving over to the Samyang, and at f1.4 this lens actually has less pincushion distortion than the Sony, though the corners are slightly darker due to vignetting vignetting. At the center, there's no chromatic aberration, which is good, and the results are about on par with the Sony in terms of sharpness. Moving over to the corners, and the sharpness drops off a tiny bit, but again, the results are still pretty much identical to that of the Sony lens. The Samyang isn't able to focus quite as close as the Sony and has a minimum focusing distance of 0.9 meters or 2.95 feet. At the center, there's no evidence of chromatic aberration, but despite the sharpness being pretty good, it just isn't quite as sharp as the Sony when shooting at this closer distance. So now it's the time you've probably all been waiting for. It's that time to take a look at some of the real-world examples of what these lenses can create. When comparing the results side by side, it really is difficult to tell these two lenses apart in terms of sharpness. One thing you should be made aware of is that this Samyang does give images a noticeable orange tint. Though the good news is that this was fairly easy to remove using the white balance sliders in Lightroom. The Sony, on the other hand, creates a much more neutral result and requires no additional steps of editing to achieve natural looking skin tones. Okay, so let's talk about bokeh now. Both of these lenses offer a nice soft blur to the background when shooting wide open. When setting the Samyang to f1.4, you do get a slightly thicker blur, which is definitely nicer than the f1.8 of the Sony lens. The difference in bokeh really shows in this bokeh balls test. The shape of the bokeh balls created by these lenses is fairly similar, with both lenses offering round orbs in the center, which slowly turn into a cat's eye shape as they near the edges of the frame. However, the Samyang creates noticeably larger orbs, which I think gives a much nicer result overall. Now, earlier in the test, I did allude to the fact that I may have had some slight issues when focusing with the Samyang. Well, although everything seemed to be going so well during the shoot, once I uploaded the images to Lightroom, I had a bit of a shock to find that more than half of the images that I'd taken were just totally out of focus, despite my camera reassuring me throughout the shoot that the focus was locking onto Amber's eyes and face with no issues. Now, on the shoot day, we had 3 different setups with 3 different outfits in 3 different locations, and in every set of images, the vast majority of the shots I took with the Samyang, they were all out of focus to varying degrees. Some shots were just only out of focus, but others were so far out of focus, it was beyond a joke. In contrast, when looking at the images I took with the Sony, nearly all of them were in focus and pin sharp. One thing I should mention is that over the past year, I have tested 3 different copies of this Samyang 85mm on this channel, and out of the 3 copies I've tested, 2 of them have given me weird focusing issues. The first time I tested it, I had to send it back immediately because it would randomly brick my camera while shooting for no apparent reason. The second copy that I got seemed to work absolutely fine, didn't have any problems at all. And now this third copy of the lens has some issues going on with the AF as well. So either I'm very, very unlucky with the copies that I test, or there's some sort of quality control problem over at the Samyang factory. Either way, this lens has yet to leave me with a very good impression, which is a real shame because of about the 5 images that it did manage to capture in focus, I was actually really happy with the results. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Okay, so with the ranting over, we've now finished all of the rounds of testing, so it's time to pick a winner. So I'm going to go through each round of testing and award a point to the lens that has provided the best performance in that round. At the end of the scoring, the lens with the most points is the winner. The first round is price, and because the lenses cost pretty much the same, this round is a draw and they both get a point. Next up, it's build quality, and honestly, both lenses feel really well built, so I think it's only fair that they both share a point in this round. In terms of handling, I'm going to give the point to the Sony, mainly because it's slightly smaller and lighter, but also because it offers some really nice additional features, including a manual MF to AF switch and also that customizable button. When it comes to AF performance, I think it's safe to say that the Sony was by far the more reliable option during testing, so the Sony gets the point here too. In our bokeh balls test, the slightly wider aperture of f1.4 that the Samyang offers did provide much bigger bokeh balls, and the fall off was slightly better than that of the Sony. So in this round, the Samyang picks up the point. In terms of image quality, I don't think you'd be disappointed with either of these lenses, and after studying the lens chart results and our final portrait images, it's simply too close of a call to give an overall winner. So I'm calling this round a draw as well. So in a nutshell, if you're looking to pick up one of these 85mm lenses for your collection, my recommendation would be to go for the Sony. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We release new content just like this every single Friday, so I'll see you again next week.